As our panelists take the stage and get seated, let me introduce our discussion. Earlier this year, California State Senator Mark Leno introduced legislation that would revise the penalty for simple drug possession under the state law, making drug possession laws that punish as a felony would now be punished as a misdemeanor. The new legislation, SB 1506, does not apply to anyone involved in selling or manufacturing drugs. The stated purpose of the bill is that it would help alleviate overcrowding in state prisons and county jails and ease pressure on California's court system and result in millions of dollars in annual savings for both state and local governments. Senator Mark Leno, who couldn't join us today, has been quoted as saying, quote, "There is no evidence to suggest that long prison sentences deter or limit people from abusing drugs. In fact, time behind bars and felony records often have horrible unintended consequences for people trying to overcome addiction because they are unlikely to receive drug treatment in prison and have few job prospects and educational opportunities when they leave. This legislation will help implement public safety realignment and protect our communities by reserving prison and jail space for more serious offenders." Commenting on the fact that 13 other states have already moved in this direction, Senator Leno has said, quote, "In fact, the experience of these other states when treating drug possession as a health issue has resulted in better public safety outcomes, which can result in safer communities." George, why don't we start with you? You're dedicated most of your adult life to fighting crime and to trying to make communities safer. As the elected district attorney of San Francisco, you've committed yourself to that, and yet you've broken away from the position held by, I believe, every other elected district attorney in California to support Mark Leno's measure. Why is that?
Thanks, Matt. And yes, and before I go on, I want to thank Marty Vranicar for being here. Even though we disagree, I think it was really important to have the point of view of the 57 other elected DAs in the state. I think it's important to understand in our dialogue. So Marty, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, George.
Also, as Marty's someone that I respect a great deal. He has been involved in public safety for many years and doing very honorably serving the LA City Attorney as well as in his current position. Actually, for me, this has been a journey. This is not like, the light switch went on yesterday. I have been involved in public safety for about 30 years. I have seen the war on drugs from the ground up. I have seen it as a police officer, a young police officer, walking footbeats in South Central and East LA. I saw the revolving door, the impact that revolving door was having in many communities. And as I rose through the ranks, I began to take a very different look at the way that we deal with crime and we deal with public safety. And as I evolved throughout the years, I came to the conclusion that what we had been doing with the war on drugs was leading us in the wrong direction. The impact that it had, in not only in community college, but quite frankly on our entire community, was creating a situation that doesn't necessarily make us any safer. And frankly, I think that we have criminalized an area that should be really looked upon as a health issue more than as a criminal issue. And I think consequently, a lot of the solutions that we have tried in the last two and a half decades have taken us to a place where today we cannot afford it economically. I can tell you that socially we have been broken for many years, but now the economic piece of it has come to play, and that's probably why, quite frankly, we're reacting. I think often we can deal with being socially bankrupt much easier than we can deal with being economically bankrupt. And I think that now we have come to the point where there's an intersection between the two. Having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that simply taking people that are broken, because most of the people that have drug addictions are people that are broken, and just simply releasing them onto the streets or lowering the level of penalty without having a services that recognize that those people need a lot of help and that we have to be there in order to support them, it's not necessarily good policy either, and I think that that could also create some serious problems for us. I am supporting 1506 because I believe that it starts to take us in the right direction. I don't believe that 1506 is necessarily the destination. I see 1506 as the beginning of a journey that we all have to embark together when we start looking at drug addiction and the impacts of drug use as more of a health issue than as a criminal issue. Having said that, I recognize that we're not there yet, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I believe that 1506 begins to take us in that direction. That's why I'm supporting, and that's why I'm here today.
Mr. Nadelmann, I'm wondering if you might be able to place this in a larger context for us. You heard George Gascon's remarks. Are they shared by folks in other states that have moved towards a similar type measure?
Well, there are a growing, small but growing number of other district attorneys around the country, in Albany County, New York, in Philadelphia, in Atlanta, Dallas, who are really beginning to break ranks with the broader DA's associations and call for various types of reforms to the drug laws and drug enforcement. I think that one of the contexts that's so important here and that people so often lose sight of is that this bill 1506 is a small effort in the state of California and a broader country, the United States, to try to roll back the horrendous rates of incarceration that have happened in this country over the last 30 years. I mean, that's the context, right? The United States, I think most of you know these numbers now, but we're less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We rank first in the world in the per capita incarceration of our fellow citizens. I mean, the Russians are fading fast into second or third place together with the Belarusians, right? Our rates of incarceration are 5, 6, 7, 8 times those in most other societies, Europe and elsewhere, even though their rates of nonviolent crime and illicit drug use are not that much different than ours. So if another country were to lock up its own people at the rate that we do, and if our rates of incarceration were more normative to the rest of the world, we would regard what that other country was doing as a massive violation of human rights. That's the way we would look at it. Now, the other point here is what we're doing is not even consistent with American history. I mean, we had 500,000 people behind bars in 1980. Now we have 2.3, 2.4 million people behind bars. We almost have 500,000 people today behind bars just for a drug law violation. As many people behind bars today for a drug law violation as we had for everything in 1980. So it's not consistent with global standards. It's not consistent with our own history. It's costing a vast amount of money. And I think what you see is for some of the DAs and others are beginning to say enough is enough. We're seeing prison populations beginning to decline. But when it comes down to the question, who are the first people we should stop putting behind bars? Who's the people who really don't belong there? It's people whose only offense is possession of a substance to put in their own body, right? That's the first group that need to be let out.
Marty, let me ask you, you're obviously a part of the California District Attorneys Association. As we were talking before the panel began, you shared with me that your organization has previously supported a measure that Mark Leno brought forward to lower the punishment for possession of less than an ounce of marijuana from a misdemeanor to an infraction. In this case, your organization is staunchly opposed to it. What do you say to Mr. Nadelmann and to Mr. Gascon?
Well, I think one of the things that I want to point out is in terms of the changes that are currently taking place in California's criminal justice system is we have embarked on a very, very large experiment, and that's called realignment. Prison population in California is going to approach by sometime next year the federal mandate of 130,000. We've already released some 50,000 individuals to serve their time locally. And these offenses that we were talking about here are currently in the list of offenses that were to be served in county jails now. And if the notion here is to provide services and treatment to these individuals from a practical point of view, and I lean heavily on my experience as a misdemeanor prosecutor for all those years when we did possession offenses, when we tried many under the influence offenses, especially heroin. I don't see that under the current system that reducing these penalties from felony to misdemeanor is going to have any incentive for this population to obtain treatment. I also do not agree that under this measure that locally there will be additional monies available for treatment. I noticed in the list of supporters for Senator Leno's measure, it's heavily supported by people in the treatment community. I think that that's great because we all understand that treatment does work. Treatment in these forms of addiction will help these people get on track because they are broken. I think that there's a general understanding among the prosecution community that that is the case, that treatment is the goal. But in my mind, and in the minds of the majority of the DAs around the state, the current state of misdemeanors with our county jails being overcrowded, no person sentenced to a misdemeanor offense is going to do any jail time whatsoever. If they don't have jail as an incentive to engage in treatment, then there's nothing there other than their own will to finally do something about their addiction.
Marty, let me ask you just as a follow-up. What do you say then that the only thing, if you're saying that currently being charged with a felony is going to result in drug treatment or maybe a sentence that isn't going to send someone to state prison, what do you say to someone that says, well, what do you do with the felony conviction? You're making a lot of felons out of people who are committing simple drug offenses.
I think probably that if you were to look at a lot of individuals who end up getting convicted of possession, the arrest charge was probably either possession for sales or a sales case, and the individual took a deal for simple possession. I think that you still have the majority of those individuals who were incarcerated in state prison for possession either had strike priors, serious offenses, or they had pled down to from a sales case.
Tal, let me ask you perhaps to respond to Marty's point. You're a deputy public defender here in San Francisco. You've handled hundreds of drug cases, drug possession cases. You've been, a lot of people, it caught their attention when you were quoted in the press saying that the way we handle drug enforcement here in California is in effect a war on crumbs instead of the often used phrase war on drugs. How do you respond to his remarks?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that the majority of people who are caught up in the criminal justice system and who are prosecuted for this type of offense, for possession offenses, and to some degree possession for sale offenses, the vast majority are indigent people. And the vast majority of those indigent people are people of color. And so what you have is you have two systems in place. You have a system where privileged, white, middle-class people basically use drugs, college campuses, frat parties, nightclubs. They use drugs with impunity. They don't have to worry about being caught. And then you have a system that comes down like a ton of bricks on indigent poor people. And that's one of the reasons why I think this type of reform is a positive first step. Because if you are going to make drug possession illegal, at least make it a misdemeanor and not a felony. At least don't stigmatize and label an entire population of people as felons and prevent them from getting housing, getting education. so I guess the point is it's a question of fairness. You know, it's like we shouldn't have two systems. One where based on your race or your class, you can access treatment and move on with your life, and another one where because of law enforcement tactics and focus, you end up caught up in a system where you can never move on. You're permanently trapped. You're permanently weighed down by having a felony conviction. The reason I call it a war on crumbs is because of the types of people that we see at the Hall of Justice. I brought with me some props. I brought with me a sweetener packet, okay? This is a gram of sweetener. Most of the time, this is on the high end of the amount of narcotics that we see people in possession of. Sometimes people have 2 or 3 sweetener packages on them, and we call them drug dealers. You know, that's why we call it a war on crumbs, because the amounts that we're talking about are minuscule. And the fact that you can have a felony conviction on your record and all of those disabilities for the rest of your life based on that felony conviction, based on possession of less than a packet of sweetener, to me, that's outrageous, you know. And this is a positive first step, in my opinion, because at least you remove some of the stigma that's attached to this type of issue, which, in my opinion, should be a public health issue. It's a public health issue for a certain segment of the community. It should be a public health community issue for everybody.
Tal, let me... Tal, let me follow up and just say, you know, opponents of Mark Leno's measure would say that it's not the amount of drug that somebody is in possession of. The fact that they're using drugs indicates that they've got to find a way to supply themselves with ongoing, you know, sources of drugs, or by taking the drugs, they're going to place themselves in a state that makes them more likely to commit crime. Is this a valid argument?
Well, I think there are, I think the elephant in the room is that not everybody who uses drugs is a drug addict. And there's a segment of the population that recreationally uses narcotics, and they don't necessarily need treatment, and they certainly don't need a felony conviction. That having been said, if you are an addict, it doesn't make any sense to turn you into a felon addict. I mean, we just heard that person before very eloquently talk about spending most of his life incarcerated, and he's made it. But the fact of the matter is, the encumbrance of a felony conviction is so debilitating. You know, countless times you run into people who can't get jobs, can't get housing, can't get education, so it's a trap. So if we are really going to deal with addiction, it makes no sense to turn an addict into a felon.
Chief Still, you've been committed to evidence-based practices in your administration of the Adult Probation Department. To what extent does that inform your approach when you look at Senator Leno's measure and deciding whether or not to support it?
My view is not only from evidence-based practices, but it also from spending almost 30 years working in the California prison system, managing prisons, working in prisons, performing oversight. And what I know and what I can definitively say after 30 years is that prison does not address nor change behavior. In fact, it actually, for those that do have addictions and illnesses, in fact, it actually makes them worse. It's like sending individuals that have a sickness to a criminal camp. You know, they learn how to be better criminals, but they still don't get their addiction addressed. And the research out there tells us that incapacitation, period, does not change behavior. It also tells us that basically what changes behavior is approximately about 200 hours of dosage intensive treatment, and you do not have to go to prison or jail in order to get those services. But yet we're spending $56,000 a year, and in fact overcrowded our prisons so much that the Supreme Court had to weigh in basically and put a cap on the state prison system, which they're working towards it, but they're not getting there. Realignment took us in a good direction in terms of trying to reduce the population that's going to state prison. But I think what 1506 does is it takes that next step to say we really need to look at, as a criminal justice system, what we're doing, who we're sending to prison or to jail, and what we're spending our money on. And evidence-based practices tells us that the majority of these individuals, they need treatment, and they need intensive treatment, and it's more cost-effective and provides a better return on investment to the taxpayers to provide intensive services, as well as then it reduces victimization, because you don't have addicts out there stealing to support their habit and those other subsequent crimes. And in addition to that, dealing with the addiction breaks the cycle of crime and breaks that intergenerational cycle that exists. Looking in prisons and managing them, I've seen generations of families come through the system, and it's because their behavior, their addictions have not been appropriately dealt with. And we spent millions of dollars in the prison system researching substance abuse treatment. And what we know and what the research told us was the fact that it wasn't putting somebody in prison, and it wasn't the amount of treatment in prison or jail that changed the behavior. It was the treatment out in the community after that individual was released and had to deal with life stressors. And so what evidence-based practices tells us is that there is a more effective way to where we can get a better return on our investment. 1506 is one of those strategies, and it also reduces victimization and breaks the cycle of crime so we don't have the next generation coming into the system.
Wendy, let me ask you this. It seems that over the years there's been an acceptance that somebody could be on probation and perhaps get caught when they give, let's say, urine test or whatever is the, requirement of their probation with, let's say, a dirty test, testing positive for marijuana. And slowly over the years, it seems like the probation department gave that less importance. There was a time when that would have been treated as a violation. Over time, it hasn't been treated as a very serious violation. Tal raised the issue about responsible drug use. And when we get into the area of heroin or cocaine or other drugs, are you seeing that there are some probationers that can, in fact, use these substances in a recreational manner and still be otherwise law-abiding?
Well, first I'll say, as an officer of the court, my job is to, of course, enforce the law. But with that said, I think what probation has realized, and just not San Francisco probation, although I think we're a very progressive leader, is the fact that there are underlying problems that is causing the drug usage. There is trauma that's out there. People talk about rehabilitating, but in reality, for the majority of our clients, they haven't been rehabilitated in the first place. The circumstances in which they grew up, the lack of parenting, the lack of role modeling. We talk about, being disadvantaged, which I completely agree with. All you have to do is take a look at the demographics of our adult probation population. 60% are African American. And, that begins to tell the story. And so while our job is responsible for certainly holding the clients in compliance with their term and condition, which, no drug usage would be one of them, we also recognize that you have to deal with the underlying problem, just not lock people up, because that's not going to deal with the problem and it's not going to change the behavior. And I think that's what we've learned to focus on is what can we do, what kind of intervention to create a strength-based approach to where we're providing rewards also when someone is doing good and recognizing their progress, not just sanctioning them when in fact they relapse, because relapse is a fact and it's part and parcel to addiction recovery.
George, let me ask you, Marty raised the point that the reason that we need the felony possibilities with drug possession offenses is that we need an incentive for people to choose treatment when they are charged with a crime. Do you agree with him?
I don't, but I understand where Marty's coming from. I think that we have to make sure, though, that when we're treating this as a misdemeanor, that we do have a tool to ensure that people that need treatment are going to be afforded the opportunity and are going to have treatment. I also agree with Tal that not necessarily everybody that uses drugs is an addict, and not necessarily everybody that uses drugs needs to have treatment. But having said that, the people that often we will come in contact with will be people that have a severe drug abuse problem. Generally, they also have a mental health issue problem. There are often housing problems, employment, there are many other problems. And that's the population that we deal with often. And I think that, figuring a way to have an intervention so that services are available for those that need it the most, I think is really important. I don't necessarily agree that a felony conviction is the vehicle to do so, but I think that we have to make sure that as we lower the sanctions here, that we do have the tools and that we have the ability to distinguish between people that have a drug addiction problem and people that are using drugs recreationally and otherwise are a functional person.
We're going to be taking audience questions shortly, so if you have a question, just try to get the attention of someone in the aisles. Ethan, let me ask you this. In California, there are a number of offenses, drug possession offenses, that are punished already as misdemeanors. I think methamphetamine, PCP, I think Valium, certain steroids, and yet we treat as felonies the possession of cocaine and heroin as felonies. Did you see this kind of discrepancy in the other states that your organization has worked to?
Matt, if I could, I think the perspective I could offer that would be more useful in that is really putting what the U.S. is doing and California is doing in a more global perspective. Because what one sees around the world is a growing number of countries that are choosing to decriminalize the possession of all drugs. One sees the proposals now emerging from Mexico did this a couple of years ago in a small way. The president of Colombia has proposed it, Argentina, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, some of them with right-wing governments, very tough on crime. And they're suggesting that in Europe, similarly, it's not generally the standard to be putting people behind bars for possession of any drug in small amounts for one's own personal use. And perhaps the paramount example of success in this regard is Portugal. Portugal 11 years ago decriminalized the possession of all drugs in personal use amounts. Drug selling is still illegal. You can still be arrested for that. They began doing evaluations a few years ago. Now, you do not go to jail for possession of any drug in a small amount, and you are not drug tested. Nobody gets thrown back in for dirty urines and all this sort of stuff. It's now been in place for 11 years. The research on that, and I recommend a piece by Alex Stevens and Caitlin Hughes in the British Journal of Criminology, and I can send it to you if those of you want to ask me later, by and large found that the results have been very, very positive. That essentially drug use did not go up, that issues like HIV and Hep C and overdose fatalities all went down, arrests went down, crime went down, people continued to seek treatment, that the rates of drug use in Portugal did not go up at the same rates as it did in comparable countries in Europe. That suggests powerful evidence that you can not just turn something from a felony to a misdemeanor, but eliminate the criminalization of drug possession in small amounts without suffering negative consequences in terms of public health or public safety. Now, when Marty said before about, people have no incentive to go into drug treatment. I mean, if I could, it reminded me of the comedian. Remember he said, I have, when all you have is humor, it's a hammer and everything looks like a nail. I think the perspective for prosecutors is when all you have is the criminal sanction, everything looks like a nail. And therefore, the only way to get people into treatment is to threaten them with a criminal sanction. Now, in fact, tens of millions of Americans have gone to AA and NA without the criminal sanction. And when you have evidence, I remember this, one of the first needle exchange programs in Tacoma, Washington, what they found was that the needle exchange program was the principal point of source of recommendations into drug treatment. Think about it. People come to a needle exchange program so that they can safely use their drugs without getting an infection or spreading it to other people. There's no coercion involved. It's the most supportive environment you can have for somebody who's an active drug user. Yet that became the principal point of reference and recommendation to conventional drug treatment programs. What that suggests is that when people need to get help, when people are trying to get better, what they most need is to be able to have the opportunity to find their own dignity, their own self-dignity, their own worth. Having a judge or a prosecutor with a hammer over your head saying, you better be clean or I'm throwing you to jail, you better give me clean urines or I'm sending you to jail, that may work for some people, There's no reason to make that the one-size-fits-all model. In fact, huge numbers of people will and do seek out treatment, whether it's methadone or 12-step or anything else, if that treatment is respectful, if it's quality, if it has evidence of success. We do not need the criminal sanction in order to get people into drug treatment.
I find it relatively interesting that we have on the books that was passed by the people of California Initiative, Proposition 36, which provided a means for individuals to get treatment and avoid the criminal sanction. We have practically every county around the state has both pre-plea or post-plea diversion programs for individuals who are charged with felony possession, can complete that program and not have that conviction. And yet this overlays now under Senator Leno's bill. This would create a parallel system, but only for misdemeanors. And I note the only sanction for an individual who refuses probation for a misdemeanor is to pay a $500 drug program fee. Or if it's a second offense, he gets charged with $1,500. But if he accepts probation, then the fee is cut down to $250 or $500 for a second or subsequent offense. Now, where are these individuals, majority of whom are involved in this trade, are indigents? Where's this money going to come from? There's already an escape provision for ability to pay that the judge has to consider whether or not these individuals have that ability to pay. So again, I get back to we've got these programs that allow an escape from the criminal sanction, and people don't take advantage of it. Maybe I am looking at the fact that with a hammer, everything out there is a nail. But I just don't see Senator Leno's legislation fostering any different. Now, if you're talking ultimately decriminalization, because I think that's where this is headed, then that's a different story.
Marty, let me just ask you, has your organization put together any information that would counter claims that decriminalization in this manner has been successful in these other states that have moved in that direction?
We have not done any white papers on that issue.
Wendy, can you respond to Marty's last argument? I mean, he's in effect saying that if you come into the criminal justice system with a drug possession charge as a felony, you're probably not going to end up with a felony conviction if you're willing to seek treatment, and very unlikely that you would go to state prison. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it depends upon what county you're in. I think San Francisco is the only county in the state that currently has a Prop 36 court that is still actively working because the state has defunded all the Prop 36 courts and efforts throughout the states. And so I think this provides, Senator Leno's bill really does the right thing. It tries to move in a direction to where it's not contingent upon how much money is available within one jurisdiction or not. It actually frees up $64 million of general fund at the state level that could be reinvested into services. I know when you look at realignment, for example, here in San Francisco, a third of our dollars for realignment has been invested in substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, and housing, but we've made that choice. I think if you compare us, though, to many other jurisdictions, we have a collaborative court continuum that is unmatched in other parts of the state. So I think to say that they would, it's not happening. And if you take a look at jurisdictions, other counties throughout the state, you will find heavy incarceration rates and not use. And in fact, the prosecutors not using those programs. We're very fortunate in our district attorney. He is very visionary, and I just commend him for his stepping out there and taking this position, which I support also in terms of, we have got to focus on treatment rather than say, well, there's this program or that program, when in fact the state hasn't funded it. And so it's placed that burden on the local counties.
Tal, can you respond to Marty's point and Wendy's?
I can just say, based on my experience dealing with individuals who have drug problems, most of the time, I don't think that the threat of a quote-unquote felony conviction is necessarily going to prevent them from using. I think what would make more sense is to provide them with more services and to be more individualized in terms of treatment and how we address specific individuals. I also would note that when you are facing a misdemeanor charge, you're facing up to a year in county jail. Now, sometimes you don't do a year in county jail because of changes that we've made to good time credits, but there is a threat potentially of incarceration that's attached to a misdemeanor conviction. So I think that's threat enough. If you really are looking for hammers and nails, why not just have the threat of a misdemeanor period of incarceration? The other thing I would say is that the recent trend has actually been to implement shorter periods of flash incarceration so that you actually provide an immediate sanction to address a particular problem, which has had, based on the research I've seen, greater success in changing behaviors because it's more of a cognitive behavioral model. It's like a reward, punishment, immediate system, whereas just putting people in state prison and warehousing them for extended periods of time, especially when we all know that, unfortunately, going to prison doesn't mean that you don't have access to illegal narcotics. That doesn't seem either to necessarily, be a solution.
Marty, you want to respond, or?
Well,
I promised to Marty that we would be careful to give him equal time here.
no, that's all right. That's all right. I already feel the glow of San Francisco's progressive approach to these things. And in defense to the other counties, I think that's the challenge that we always face with legislation. Should one size fit all? And I think that the whole purpose of the realignment approach was to allow individual counties to experiment with programs in dealing with individuals who are charged with crimes, either providing treatment, a little bit more treatment model, and a locally based model because those individuals are from those specific communities. And I think those communities need to have the flexibility to be able to develop those local solutions. Obviously, San Francisco is blessed with a probation chief. She told me earlier that certain misdemeanors are supervised by probation. That's not the general rule throughout California. I think Los Angeles, where I'm from, there was no supervision for misdemeanors by the probation department. Those individuals were on court summary probation, which meant go home and sin no more, and if you do, you'll be back here to see us. And so I think that once again, I go back to the fact that under the current system, because we have so many of those individuals who were once incarcerated at the state level, being pushed down to the counties, there's no room at the end in terms of the county jails. So misdemeanants are not going to be sentenced to county jail. They're going to be sentenced out there in the community service, or whatever. And for those individuals who do need some measure of control and supervision to deal with their addiction problems, it's not going to happen at the misdemeanor level.
Let me go to a couple of the questions from the audience. I've shared them with our district attorney. George, two questions there. One related to whether or not drug possession should be treated differently for adults than from juveniles, and in a question about Back on Track, whether or not that program would be positively or adversely affected by Senator Leno's proposal?
Right. Yes, let me start with the first question concerning juveniles. I think juveniles definitely need to be treated differently, and certainly here in San Francisco we do. We very seldom, well, in fact, I know for a fact that we do not criminalize simple possession of drugs. There's a lot of other vehicles that we use to deal with juveniles before it ever gets to a prosecution for possession of drugs. And I think there are some good reasons for that. I think that when we're talking about juveniles, we should explore every possibility that we can to decriminalize juvenile behavior in order to provide them with an opportunity to correct their behavior and move on so they can get an education, they can get employment, and they can become a productive member of society. And generally, the juveniles, again, that we deal with are not any different than the adults we deal with, right? Those are juveniles that often come from homes where supervision at the home is either not there or is very lacking. There's really a significant lack of role model support. So there are a lot of problems already that the juveniles that generally come to our attention already bring with themselves. The problem is there's still not enough funding. There's not enough vehicles to provide the services that are necessary. So that is a challenge for us. And unfortunately, often the drug abuse, and those other things do lead to more serious crimes when they in fact do become involved in a different part of the process. The other question had to do with back on track. I don't see 1506 impacting negatively on back on track. As a matter of fact, the conversations in our office are today around how do we expand the program. I think Back on Track has been a very successful program. We have used a very, very small population. And for those of you that are not familiar with Back on Track, it was a program started down at Kamala Harris where first offense, possession of drugs for sales, if the individual agreed to go through a process of training that included a partnership with Goodwill Industries and other partners. Individuals were put through the program. They receive training in a variety of areas. They were, put on a track to get gainful employment. And when they graduate from the program, their criminal record is expunged. There's a deferred entry of judgment. We are now trying to explore how do we take Back on Track and continue to move the envelope so that we include other offenses and other people. We believe it's a very successful program, and quite frankly, it's a model that I hope to expand.
We've got a video message from Senator Leno we were going to play. Is that right? Is it ready to go? Here we go.
Welcome, everyone, to the 2012 Justice Summit. I'm Mark Leno, and I so wish that I could be with you today, but I'm attending to my legislative duties in Sacramento. I also want to thank you for your interest in criminal justice reform and all your energies and efforts on its behalf. We know that this is an issue that is of great importance to the state of California and to the nation. And of course, we have the opportunity to yet again lead the way in reform here in California. We're authoring a bill this year, SB 1506, which would redefine the crime of simple possession of a drug from felony to misdemeanor. There are 13 other states and the federal government which already do this. And in those 13 other states, we have the data that shows that we get better results, better outcomes, meaning safer communities. And surprisingly, these states include not only the large eastern states of Pennsylvania and New York, but also states like Mississippi, South Carolina, West Virginia, Wyoming, Iowa, all of which use this misdemeanor charge rather than felony. And what we find in these 13 other states is that there are higher rates of drug treatment participation, lower rates of drug use, and even slightly lower rates of violent and property crime. So again, we can prove we can have safer communities. And then of course there are the unintended consequences of a felony conviction. Consequences that can really cause great damage to a young life for many decades out. The very three things that can keep someone successful in his or her recovery, access to housing, education, and employment, are put farther out of reach because of a felony conviction. especially in a down economy. Someone with a felony has great difficulty even accessing a job which just pays a minimum wage. So by putting these felony convictions on a whole population of young people, we really perpetuate a chronic underclass which benefits none of us. And then, of course, there's the inequity in the criminal justice system. Even though we can show that drug use rates are quite similar in all different ethnic communities, an African American has a 13 times greater likelihood of being convicted of the felony of simple possession. Then, of course, there's also the savings that we could experience. Our nonpartisan, independent legislative analyst's office has determined that there would be $159 million annually of savings at the county level, plus another $65 million annually in savings at the state level. And our bill would direct a portion of that savings to drug treatment programs so that we can, like these 13 other states, have greater outcomes, safer communities. I, of course, have to thank the sponsors of our bill, and we have a number of them. The ACLU, which has been such a champion for so many years, of course, the Drug Policy Alliance, as well as the NAACP. I also want to thank San Francisco's District Attorney George Gascon, who was at our committee hearing at the Senate Public Safety Committee a couple weeks back. George was there to speak on behalf of a bill that we're working on together, but he proactively came to the table for this bill, SB 1506, to say that he's been in law enforcement for 30 years and brings that 30-year experience to this consideration of our bill. And he said, this bill makes sense because drug treatment works. And this is in spite of the fact that we'll be battling the California Association of District Attorneys, along with many other arms of public safety as we move forward. So the challenge is great. But we've got the data, we've got the facts, and we know that this reform will provide great benefit to our communities, to our neighborhoods, and to all of California. Thank you for your support.
Tal, I want to go back to the question that Marty posed earlier, which was, in effect, this idea that in order to incentivize people making the decision to seek treatment, that the fear of a felony conviction or possible state prison sentence could play a positive role. You talk to a lot of people charged with crimes who are trying to make the decision of what decision to make. What is the primary motivation that you see coming from them? How do they decision make on dispositions related to drug possession as a felony?
I think that for a lot of people, it does have to be a personal decision, and they have to come to it themselves. I don't think they necessarily are thinking about whether or not they would be convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor. I will also say that sometimes you'll meet someone in county jail and they're ready to get treatment, they're ready to get help, and because of the lack of resources, they have to sit in county jail and wait for a bed to open up or wait for there to be an opportunity for them to access treatment. And one of the things that this bill would do, ideally, would be to divert some of those resources that go into enforcement and put them into treatment outlets for people. So perhaps there wouldn't be that weight that people have while they're incarcerated, where they can, lose hope or kind of slip back into their old ways of thinking. But from my experience, the longer someone's incarcerated, kind of the less incentive they have. And the people who have been in and out of prison, it's almost like they've given up hope a long time ago. And so if we can change that, if we can instill hope in people, and if we can have access to treatment in a shorter time frame so that there can really be treatment on demand, then I think you'll see different outcomes. But again, just warehousing people for extended periods of time, based on my experience when I've met people, that doesn't seem to provide them with any more incentive to get treatment when they get out. They just come out institutionalized and worse off.
Ethan, I wanted to ask you, in the other states that have that you've seen ballot measures go before the voters. Were there particular arguments that were more compelling than others? Did you find anything really caught the public's support or imagination?
Well, you know, it's interesting. My organization drafted and put on the ballot Proposition 36 back in 2000, and that included at the time doubling state funding for drug treatment by $120 million a year. We made the mistake of only putting it in there for 5 years, and eventually the funding was cut and saved taxpayers a huge amount of money. What we saw when we polled in other states around the country on Prop 36 and that sort of, because remember, Prop 36, in fact, was, because it prohibited incarceration the first 2 times somebody was arrested for possession if they did not have a criminal record, it was, in fact, a fairly substantial decriminalization statute in its own right. What we found was that even in southern states, Florida, significant majorities, over 60%, believed that people who had an addiction should not be sent to jail the first or second time, jail or prison the first or second time that they were picked up for drug possession. So you saw that as sort of a moral notion. You also, of course, see the cost savings argument. When people, I mean, I could critically say, look, most drug treatment does not work most of the time for most of the people who pursue it. That said, dollar for dollar, person for person, drug treatment is a dramatically better investment than incarceration, right? I mean, you think about it, it's treatment, it's like quitting cigarettes, right? People need multiple times. You never know if you're an ex-smoker till the day you're on your deathbed. Oh my God, I didn't smoke for the last 20 years, right? You know, cigarettes we know are more addictive than the other drugs. It takes time and this sort of stuff. But I think people responded to some extent on a moral basis, that it's just not right to put people behind bars for that. And secondly, on the cost savings piece. The third one, I think, was the utilization of law enforcement resources. We see that both with marijuana and with other drugs, that by and large, the public says, let the cops focus on real crime, predatory crimes, violent crimes, not prioritize this simple one.
I want to give everyone on the panel one last chance to make any closing remarks. Wendy, you want to lead off?
I just think realignment was a good indication that the public sentiment has changed. The polls that are out there now, the public wants accountability, but sensible accountability, and I think 1506 gives us that. And I think, you know, the comment was made regarding, you know, each of the counties and giving some more autonomy, but in fact what we found is that when you have realignment, say for example all 58 counties getting to decide what they want to do, well, if we just look at the incarceration rates across each of the counties, Fresno, like county population demographics to San Francisco in terms of raw numbers and that, but yet they incarcerate at 4 times the rate. So I think that that's why, you know, a law change that impacts on a statewide basis is more sensible than leaving it up to each county, because then you'll end up with 58 different styles and methods of criminal justice.
Cal, you want to?
Well, I was just going to, you know, I'm the public defender, so it's my job to push the envelope. And I think it's one thing to talk about reducing possession charges from felonies to misdemeanors, but I'm not sure that that's going to change the color and the demographics of the population in county jail. And there's another significant percentage of the population, young people who are coming from segments of San Francisco that are economically depressed and sometimes don't have the same opportunities, and they're out there on the street sometimes selling small amounts of drugs to these drug possessors. And until we address that problem, and until we expand programs like Back on Track exponentially, so that really the first time that you're arrested for drug sales, or if you're arrested for selling a crumb of a certain drug, you aren't labeled as a felon, labeled as a drug dealer, sent off to prison, and forgotten about. Until we address that bigger problem within the war of drugs, then our jails are still going to be filled with people of color and poor people. And the fact of the matter is, we can talk about the nitty-gritty and the details, but the war on drugs, it's not working, people. It's like you're not going to end the war on drugs one sweet and low or extra packet at a time. You know, we need to think of it holistically as a public health problem, not as a problem that we can law enforcement our way out of. And that needs to be not just possessors, but also the people who, because of economics, are selling, or the people who, to get their next hit, are selling, a rock to an undercover police officer pretending to be an addict. All those people, they all need help, and a felony conviction and incarceration is not going to solve this problem for society.
Marty? Marty, you want to, or have you thrown in the towel?
I think I've given my all for the cause here. So
George?
I'll leave it to George to put the capper on it. Thank you.
By the way, Marty, what's George's sanction for opposing the? He's one of your members, isn't he?
He certainly is, and he's a valued member of the association. As an elected official, he's entitled to his own opinion.
All right.
Thank you, Marty.
George, and then.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I have to say that, again, I want to thank once again Marty for coming here. He knew that he was going to come into an audience and that he was going to be a panel that was going to be presenting an opposing view. That is an important view, by the way. I want to repeat, it's important for us, and I am pretty much in the minority in the association. I think in concerning this particular item, I'm probably one out of 57 that believes that this is a good solution. But I think it's important for me, and it's important for all of us to recognize that there are valid points of view out there that may not agree with us, and that if we really are serious about developing solutions that work for all of us, that we have to entertain those points of view and try to reach consensus, because that is the only way that we will really create workable and sustainable solutions. Otherwise, all we're doing is we're all spinning our wheels. My reason for being here is, as it concerns 1506, is because I truly have come to the conclusion, a conclusion that is not only based on years on the ground operationally, but also years working at developing the public policy, working with the Council of State Governments and justice reinvestment and lowering incarceration around the country, and working with other people in a variety of settings in order to lower incarceration in our country, is that I don't believe that incarceration has taken us where we need to be. And I believe that the war on drugs has been a failure. I believe that when we institutionalize people over extended periods of times, what we do is we take generally low-level offenders in the early stages, we harden them, quite frankly, we send them to the university of crime, and by the time that they get out of prison, they generally become a bigger social problem. So where I come from, whether it's a drug and war or quite frankly many other areas of our criminal justice system, is I'm really on the side of saying we need to reform our system, we need to reduce the number of people that we send to jail or prison. We need to reserve that space for people that are truly dangerous to all of us and that have no way of fixing themselves. And there will always be some of those people, by the way. I think that we have to realize that, yes, there will be some people that will go to prison because the rest of us need to have some people in prison in order for us to be safe. But that is a very small minority, and there are many other solutions out there, whether it's someone that has engaged in possession of drugs, somebody that has a drug addiction, or quite frankly, people engaged in some other low-level crimes, that if we move away from incarcerating these people in the early stages and deal with different forms of behavior modification, we are going to not only be a safer society, but we're going to be a more just society, and we're going to be able to spend more money in parks and schools and many other endeavors as opposed to our prison system.
Ethan, give you the final word.
Yeah. I thought the person on the panel who was going to most provoke me was Marty, but in fact it was Tal. I mean, when he said that his job as public defender is to push the envelope, that's my job description. I mean, as head of Drug Policy Alliance. So I really wanted to finish with this. I wanted to bring it back to basically what I think are our three key ethical points. And the first one is this. I don't think that there is any legitimate basis in science or medicine or any ethical code that I know of, or the Bible for that matter, for our criminal law distinguishing between those people who put alcohol and tobacco in their body and those people who put other substances in their body. That there is no legitimate basis for distinguishing between the recreational alcohol user and the recreational marijuana, cocaine, or heroin user. And there is no legitimate basis for distinguishing between the alcoholic on the one hand under our criminal law and between the drug addict on the other hand, the illicit heroin and cocaine addict. That's first. The second ethical point I would make, and I hope most or all of you agree with this, is I don't believe that anybody should be punished simply for what we put into our own bodies absent harm to others. That nobody but nobody deserves to be punished for what we put in our own bodies absent harm to others. Get behind the wheel of a car and you're under the influence? Yes. Hurt somebody? Yes. And don't tell me your addiction was the excuse, et cetera, et cetera. But we each need to be regarded as sovereign over our own minds and bodies. That means that the criminal law should not be treating anybody as a criminal for what we put in here. And thirdly, that when one is trying to pursue a particular public health or public safety objective, in this case, reducing the harms of drugs or whatever it might be, and when you have powerful evidence that a non-coercive system can accomplish that public safety and health objective as well or better than a coercive system, when a Portugal-like approach can accomplish that objective as well or better for a lower cost and with all sorts of other savings than the American coercive system, then as a matter of good public policy and as a matter of ethics and morality, one is compelled to demand that the government rely on the non-coercive approach over the coercive approach. I think those three key moral points are fundamental to when we think through the future of drug policy in this state and in this country. Thank you.
Let's thank all of our panelists. Thank you very much for participating.
Okay, in closing the program, I just have 1 minute. I just wanted to thank all of you for coming to the 2012 Justice Summit. One thing that has distinguished our work and what we've done at these summits is action. And if you look at over the past 9 years since we've been doing these summits, we have the evidence to prove that. Out of our first summit came the call to have a community-based collaboration that helped youth and families work together on a community-based level. Since then, we've developed the MAGIC programs, the Mobilization for Adolescent Growth in our communities, both in the Western Addition and Bayview Hunters Point. Out of the second summit came a call for better coordination of reentry services, and from that sprung the Reentry Council, which is now the official policy body. And I can go on and talk about what we've achieved over the past 9 years, but really what we're looking to achieve this year is to make strides going forward, particularly in the area of violence reduction and gangs. We've heard about the strategies today. We've seen the promise of law enforcement being able to work together with community-based organizations that are dedicated to violence reduction. So this is possible, but only if you all get involved. So for those of you that are here and for those of you that are watching at home, get involved, pick up the phone. You can go to our website to keep up with developments, sfpublicdefender.org. We are planning to create initiatives around each of the subject areas that we've talked about today around gang and violence reduction, neuroscience, and applying brain science to the law, and finally advocating for drug reform. Again, this is a banner year for criminal justice. On the ballot, we have the 3 Strikes initiative that will limit the application of 3 strikes to only serious offenses. Also, the ballot measure, the state measure, which will eliminate the death penalty. So with that, again, thank you for all of you for coming, for all the volunteers that made this possible. I want to thank the San Francisco Public Library for every year they've provided us this wonderful venue to do this event, and also SF TV for putting us on the tube. So again, we'll see you next year. Keep in touch. Thank you.